Hello, everybody. So I am Jacob Swain. I'm the pastor at Redeemer Community Church. And yesterday we had a power outage that happened in the middle of the service. And so part of the sermon is missing. And so I want to pick up where the video from yesterday left off so that folks who weren't here are able to still benefit from all of the message, because we were in Matthew chapter 7 in the Sermon on the Mount, where we've been now for quite a while. And let's see, I think we got through, we were in the middle of discussing, still in verses 7 and 8, we were talking about the asking and the knocking. And I think the power went out right as I was saying that I understand that there is discomfort for a lot of us when it comes to asking and asking God again and again, because he's an omniscient, all-knowing God who knows what we need before we ever ask him. And so the question is, why do we have to not just ask him, but ask and ask? And the answer is going to seem silly maybe to some, and it may not be the most satisfactory answer to some of us, but the reason we're to ask and ask is because God tells us to. In James chapter 4 verse 2, we're told very clearly that sometimes we have not because we ask not. In other words, there are those times where God has not met a need because we haven't asked or we stopped asking. And that may hit kind of weird with you. I'm not telling you that it makes, all kinds of sense to me, but nobody's asking me really, because the scriptures are a revelation of who God is, not who I would have God to be or who I would be if I was in charge. And we're told by Jesus that we have a loving Father who loves to give us good gifts and that we ought to ask him. So I think this calls us to examine our prayer lives. I know for me, this called me to stop and reset, because I was honest with myself and realized I've gotten out of the habit of consistently bringing things to God and bringing them back to God about what I need. And so I heard this teaching from Jesus as an instruction to a discipline of bringing things to God that I'm needing or I'm wanting help with. And I've acknowledged that's uncomfortable sometimes. That's not necessarily a natural posture, but I'm told to do this by Jesus. And as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, it's kind of there in the name. I have to do what Jesus tells me to do. When Jesus says it's good and healthy to come to our loving, giving Father over and over again, that's what I have to do. And certainly I'm not making any kind of crazy claims about how God is going to be like a genie and he's going to give us everything that we ever wanted, anything that we ever asked for. But I can tell you this, and my wife, Sarah, would, I think, very much back this up. Our testimony, even just in the past month or two, is that God will get directly involved in difficult circumstances and make a way where we haven't seen a path. I had a week sometime back when I was first working on this part of Matthew 7, where I was very stressed about some things financially and how we were going to work them out. And frankly, it was just really putting me in a bad mood, and it was taking a lot of the joy out of life. I was stressed, and we prayed about it. And God did some really amazing things that went way beyond coincidence or my ability to explain them. He just did. And it very much helped to drive home for me what Jesus is saying in Matthew 7 about having this loving Father who loves us as his children and wants to give us good gifts. And so I would invite you to do this. Not just think about it sort of intellectually, not just, hear it as a good idea, but specifically put this into practice. Begin today asking God for good gifts, for healthy things in the vein of the fish and the bread that are in the message that Jesus taught, stuff that we need and that he can help with. Ask him each day. Doesn't have to be a long drawn out script. Keep telling the Lord what it is that you're needing and wait on the Lord, and feel free to let me know about those needs so that we can share them in the Echo Prayer app, so that we as a church family can be obedient to this call that you all would be bringing our requests to God. Share it with your small group. Let your Christian friends know what's going on, and they can invest in that with you and keep on top of it with you to see how God is at work answering your prayers. Okay, so there are two other parts in that passage that we read that I want to touch on. They're both well-known statements of Jesus. They're both important teachings. The first one is right after the ask, seek, knock teaching. Right after ask, seek, and knock, God is a loving Father. He loves to give good gifts. Jesus says, so do to others what you would want them to do for you. You probably learned this as the golden rule. Pretty much everybody's heard this, even if they've never been to church. Every elementary school student, I would think, has been taught the golden rule. But it's interesting because Jesus gives this teaching of the golden rule connected with the thing that we've been talking about, with the ask, seek, knock. You have this loving, generous Father who loves to give good gifts to his children, which begs the question then, how are those two things connected? How is the golden rule connected with the way that we pray? I think what Jesus is setting up is, because we have this loving Father who is so generous to us, who takes care of us as his children, that frees us up to be able to mirror that, to be able to imitate these aspects of God's character. In other words, we can be generous to others. We can treat other people the ways that we would want to be treated because God has treated us so well. I think it's interesting because there's a concept that this golden rule is universal. I think most people would say, well, all religions hold to this. Everybody has some version of this. But in reality, this version of the golden rule, do to others what you would have them to do to you, it originates with Jesus. Now, in previous Old Testament Judaism and rabbinical teaching, and certainly in other faiths around the world, there is a negative sense of this command. And that sounds like this: don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. That is there. That is a fairly universal teaching. You'll find that teaching, don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you, all over the world. And it's a good rule of thumb. I'm for it. But Jesus way surpasses that with what he says. He goes way beyond, don't just do bad stuff that you wouldn't want people to do to you. And Jesus says instead, go do good to others because you would want that done to you. And so the negative phrasing that's universal is a passive thing. You don't have to do anything. You're just being told, don't do certain bad things. But there's no obligation to actively do good and to pursue the good of others. Jesus, though, turns around and he makes a much stronger command and statement. And he says, actively pursue the good of others as God has first actively pursued good and given good to you. Now, the don't do bad stuff to people that you wouldn't want people to do to you, the law can accomplish that. Religious rules can get you there. Doesn't require love. But what Jesus says requires love. You don't have to love people to not do bad to them, but you do generally have to be rooted in a place of love if you're going to actively pursue the good of other people, to do good for somebody. And be clear, I don't mean feeling loving feelings. This is beyond that. Jesus is calling us not to a certain set of feelings. He's calling us to a certain set of actions. And he's certainly calling us beyond just do no harm. And he's saying, go do good. So take note of this, that Jesus isn't just telling his disciples, don't be mean and ugly. And take note, this is a command of Jesus. It is an expectation of Jesus. Jesus expects his disciples to intentionally help other people. Because we've experienced God's love and we've experienced God's kindness. Our cup is overflowing. We should let that overflow flow into other people's cups and fill their cups as well. And then the other thing that Jesus says at the end of the passage that we are reading today is he says this thing about enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So the way that I grew up hearing this taught is that this passage was about heaven and hell. More or less, I was taught growing up in the church that Jesus is saying most people will naturally go to hell and be awful, godless people, and some small group of people will choose to follow Jesus and go to heaven. And I suspect that probably some of you heard that as well. You heard that notion in the church. But I don't think that Jesus is primarily talking about justification. I don't think that he's primarily talking here about people's eternal destination of heaven or hell. I think what Jesus is saying is that life is lived at a crossroads. That generally at any given time that we are on a crossroads of two paths. There's an easy path and there's a harder path. And to some extent, this is philosophically found all over the world. It's what I would call general revelation. There's some sense of this, I think, all over the ancient world. You can think of this as a choice between the intentional life and the accidental life. You can think of it as a choice between the disciplined life and the undisciplined life. And I think because of the specific way that Jesus teaches it, as Christians, it is a choice between the Jesus way, the kingdom of God way, and the way of the world. But overall, I like how straightforward this is, because I think even like a 10-year-old could get the basic gist of it, that there is two ways that we can live life. There is the wide way that has plenty of room. You can go whatever direction you want. You can turn around. You can go another direction. You can go all different ways. You can go backwards if you want. No one's going to hassle you on this broad, wide path. And that sounds pretty good, right? Sounds easy. The problem with this path, Jesus says, is that it doesn't lead anywhere. Or if it does lead somewhere, it leads to destruction. It doesn't have lasting fruit. It's not going to take you anywhere good. The life doesn't last. It doesn't really go anywhere. It's just aimless wandering. It's purposeless. Has no point. It's just wandering around. And this is the way that most people in human history have lived. It's pretty much just the natural state of most of us in a broken world is to do this. We think I'm the master of my own destiny. I can do what I want. And we wander around hoping to accidentally stumble in a good direction. So it's comfortable. It's easy, but it's also useless and fruitless. It's empty in the end. And then there's another path, and it's the less popular path for a reason. It's a narrow path meaning that it doesn't have all kinds of room for going every which way. It's a very specific path. It's very direct. And it's a path that leads through harder terrain. It's less smooth. It's less comfortable. There's more trouble. There's more struggle. You are going to work harder on this narrow path. But the good thing about this path that the other path doesn't have going for it is this path goes somewhere. So it actually leads somewhere worthwhile. A life with a purpose. A life that outlives our life. And I want you especially to notice that Jesus says that the beginning of both of these paths is a gate. In other words, there's a choice that's made, and it's made at the beginning which path to take. So it's not aimless wandering back and forth from one path to the other. It's one path or we're on the other path. Jesus is very specific in his description about this. There is a gate that leads onto a path. And Jesus is the gate that leads to the narrow path. Jesus is the gate. He is the entry point to the path that goes somewhere and that has a purpose. But knowing that the gate is up front, it's not at the end. It's not about work really hard, and if you get to the end of it, then you win. If you do a really good job, then at the end of it, then Jesus is there and he'll open the gate. No, it's at the beginning. Jesus is willing to open the gate. He's willing to let you on the path. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to earn it. Jesus isn't talking about justifying ourselves, justifying our salvation, earning right standing with God. He's saying, he's inviting us onto this journey of Jesus, but that it's going to ask a lot more of us. It's going to be a harder path. It's going to be a less comfortable path. And so nobody should be selling this path of following Jesus as being easy or being comfortable. It's why Jesus himself in the Gospels tells people, count the cost, because there is a cost. Jesus says, I'll let you on this path, but you need to know it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it, but it's not going to be comfortable. And I think this is all important because sometimes people think that if they find life challenging, if they find that things in life are hard, if they find that they're confronting big emotions or they're encountering situations that are really hard to bear, then the idea is they must be doing something wrong. Certainly that is what the Jewish people living around Jesus thought, because we see it. They bring a handicapped man to Jesus, a disabled man, and they say, who caused this man to be this way? Was it his sin or was it his parents' sin? But Jesus says, you don't get it. Jesus says to his disciples, you are going to be walking a difficult road. I mean, we're just a few weeks out right now from Holy Week, where on Good Friday, we talk about the suffering of Jesus, the intense suffering of Jesus. Jesus' life was filled with suffering. The 3 years of ministry that lead up to the intense suffering of Good Friday were no cakewalk. There's plenty of suffering. It's not an easy path for Jesus. And we don't know a whole lot about the middle years of Jesus' life, those years between when he was a baby and when he's somewhere around 30 years old. There's this big, place in the middle that we just don't know a lot. But I think we can say this: if an easy life without problems and a life without struggles is the indication of right living, that you're good, Jesus would have a problem. But the good news is that's not the gospel. The reality is an intentional life is a harder life. A disciplined life is a harder life. Making careful, intentional choices about what we're going to do and who we're going to follow and what kind of life that we're going to build on what kind of foundation, those are really important questions. The hard path is often this holy path. The easier path, without work, without pain, without struggle, without grief, it may be easier, but it doesn't go anywhere. That path has no growth. It has no ultimate purpose. And what I love about the Sermon on the Mount, and especially this part of the Sermon on the Mount, is how straightforward that it is. It's hard to live, but it's not hard to understand. A little kid can understand what Jesus is saying. We know what Jesus is calling us to do. He's calling us to pray, to ask our loving Father, our generous Father, to give us those gifts that we need, to pray and to trust our Father. And he's calling us, because we have this loving, generous Father, to live in generosity to others, to do actively good for others, because God has actively done good to us. And he's calling us onto a path, an intentional life that is going to prove hard and challenging, but that we can be sure, we can trust Jesus that it's going somewhere. It may not be that these three things that Jesus has talked about are the ways that we want it to be. We might prefer that there be some other way than asking of our Father and actively seeking the good of other people, even if they're not actively seeking the good of us, and walking a difficult road that has suffering and pain and grief. Might not be the way that we want it to be, but it is the way that Jesus says that it is. It's the call for the Christian. It's the call for disciples of Jesus. And so our choice really is, how are we going to respond to that? Jesus says, come and follow me on this path. Will we do it? And so for you and I think the thing is, are we willing to check ourselves and to engage in this discipline of asking our Father, trusting our Father to meet our needs? Are we willing to live in generosity to other people, living in a place of giving to others because God has been so giving to us? And will we follow Jesus on this hard and narrow path, trusting that it's worth it in the end, because we're building a life that's bigger than ourselves, a life that will outlive our life?